I don't understand if anybody can listen to me or not.
Yeah, I can listen to you. I can listen to you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So
Yeah. Clear and
we are going
distinct.
to start. We are going to start very soon. We're just waiting for some other people to join, and then
Yeah.
we
Shall
shall
I hold
start.
on? Okay then. Okay then. Okay. Thank you.
Sarathrik, are you there?
Yeah. I'm
Yes,
still there.
Aratrika, are you there?
yes, ma'am. Yes, madam.
So should we start or
Yes, ma'am.
should we start by
I
now?
think, uh, yes, ma'am, you can start. I think students are joining.
Yeah.
So, start.
So I'm going to introduce Rajadipta before to you. Well, very good afternoon to everybody. Today, today we have with us Dr. Rajadipta Roy from Moinaguri College, and it is my honor and privilege to introduce him to you now. Somebody is speaking. Please mute yourself. Somebody is speaking. Please mute yourselves. Please mute yourselves. Once again, please mute yourselves. I'm honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Rajadipta Roy to you. Dipto is going to speak on mythic multitude and polyphonic history of the 100 years of solitude, the canonical novel of Marquez, written in 67. And one thing I must tell you that I have not heard Rajadipto, but I have gone through his works, some of his works, his writing, and his works are so full of deep insight into literature, history, and cultural history as well, that it makes them not only interesting, but very, very significant standing in this time of crisis. I'm sure that more students will join in time, and this is going to be a very interesting session. 10 minutes in the end will be for an interactive session. And now we hand over to Dr. Rajadipta Roy for his lecture on 100 years of solitude. So over to Rajadipta.
Thank you, Didi, and hello to everybody, and welcome. This is basically the kindness of Dr. Anuradha Kunda. She is my respected Didi, same time teacher also, and that she adorned me with such kind words and modest words and etc. I am nothing, whatever it is, if not taught by teachers like Dr. Anuradha Kunda and so on and so forth. So this is a great honor for me, of course, to be with you in this session, 100 years of solitude, which is a very steep challenge. I don't know whether, I should not say I don't know, rather I am sure that I shall not be able to do any text, and it cannot fit on also because man like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his text, and this text is especially, which is being talked over so many times and written over so many times in several parts of the world, this 100 years of solitude, that can be, this is untreatable. This cannot be tackled in a span of 1 hour. This is impossible. So we know that keeping these constraints and keeping these limitations in our Bible, we can approach this text, or rather the real text, in a kind of a truncated manner, as far as it is possible. But before going into those themes, I must share one thing with you, and this seems quite ironical to me, and that we are sharing a session on 100 years of solitude. You understand, you've already gone through the text, I presume. And that solitude is the most important word here. So we are going through a session of 100 years of solitude in a time when a big world of capitalism is teaching us everything that for this make or whatever we have distance. So social, this very social, has a lot to do with this idea of solitude. And that is why it seems quite challenging, at the same time funny, at the same time ironic to engage with this text at this point of time, in these times. Because you see, the best word could distance us, and that distance us from one another, of course, so that we cannot contaminate ourselves with this virus, could have been physical distancing, not social distancing. And instead, we are opting for, and we are obliged by the media and everything that teach us every day with new consent, that we have to practice this social distancing. What is with this social distancing? Is a socially distant, more often not, goes on to narrate history from such a distance that does not allow the historian to see a time, to see a life, to see a congregation or a gathering or a collective of lives at any point of time, in any place, whatever in this world. It does not allow that historian to take an intimate view of that life. If you are already distant from them socially, if you are already distant from them mythically, if you are already distant from them history, mere narration of facts going to be something broken, fragmented, distant, maybe object, and at the same time, that very superstition of science and scientism and logic, etc., do impose upon it a kind of an order which is more fictional than anything else. If history becomes a rational fiction, then we require all of this, somebody to come up to us to talk of history from a fictional eye. Fiction should be, or fiction can be, seen as history from an irrational eye. Irrational eye means, I'm using this word a little in a little bit in a hurry, and maybe in the significance of a blanket term, as a blanket term, that irrational personality. What I am trying to understand into 100 is this, that the typical rationality taught to us by this epistemology of Western archive, Western theory of knowledge, that rationality perhaps come very short to understand, appreciate the kind of lives that we do live in different corners of the world, different corners of the globe. That exactly happened with Gabriel Garcia Marquez, with his realization, when he, all of a sudden, it is that, and he was basically a man who used to inflate his stories a little bit. Afterwards, when he was given chances and opportunities to talk on his stories, talk in his novels, things, he used to always give it a very funny, twisted, and a little invented turn. He said that this book is basically a result of an epiphany. All of a sudden, the first line of the book, which is a very iconic one, in the history of global literature, world literature. All of a sudden, he says that when he was going from one town to the other, driving the car with his family, all of a sudden, that very first line struck him. And that line almost the door to him, doors of perceptions were being opened to him. And he came back, he simply curtailed the journey. He came back to his house, rushed to his room and started writing. And after 18 long months, this book was produced. He says that it was an incessant writing. Every day I used to set my pen on my paper. Why? And when asked the question why, he says that he writes about the intimate history of my people. Now, this is this term, intimate history, or the intimate lives of the people of Colombia, that he always wanted to tell. Many of his tales, he had a point to make. As we know, in very systematic and canonical studies of literature, it is often being told to us, it is taught to us rather, that we have to start from understanding and writing or creating from a local level, and then we have to translate on the universal level. First, we have to locate our writing, our understanding, our everything, the whole, the materials and the elements in our LOCALE, L-O-C-A-L-E, and then we have to transform it and transcend the local and transform it, and also has to discover or to put inside some elements of universality, so within quotes, of course, so that this may add to everybody world, and that is basically the transcendent aesthetic value of any creativity, be it a music piece, be it literature, be it or whatever it is. Marquez and says that, well, I never wanted his interviews, and this is the book of interview I show you because this is quite available. This book is quite available. It can be found in almost in every book, or you can order it so over Amazon and play. Very good book because it gives us a lot of insight into the making of his novels, because he himself is talking on different things, different aspects of life in this book. So in this book, in one of his beautiful things, beautiful interviews, in an excerpt, he is telling that when I took to write these things, I tried to locate my local in the universal. Tried to transform my local into the universal. It was the universal that I was trying to see, and then I discovered a speck of local inside the universal, and then I simply blown it up. The moment I blew it up, the moment it was being blown up, then I saw that in my hand there was 100 years, which is not only action, but also a history. Big history of everything, big history of the whole, not only Colombia, but the whole history of the intimate lives of the Colombian people, as well as the Latin American people, comes to be written in such a convoluted narrative, which ranges up to almost a length of 422 pages in the standard Penguin edition, translated by Gregory Rabasa, one of the best translators of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. One issue, perhaps the best translator of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And there, he simply performed that magic. That magic is tremendous. Everybody of you who has gone through this book, you will see that this history of the intimate lives can never be approached, can never be written with an idea of a linear history. Where is the historiography, standard historiography, what is being taught to us in our schools and colleges, is different from, in what ways it is different from this mythic historical process which is into its fold a lot of voices and dialogues, where dialogues do sense history of not only people, of the life, of their feelings, of their beliefs, of their unbeliefs, unlearnings, of their deeds, of their everything. And people are coming almost in flesh and blood in front of our eyes. And at one particular sweep, we are also being included into the narrative. That we will become, of course, aware. That awareness of ours are kept in deferral. We will come to understand that we are also a part of that particular village, afterwards which became a town, and that locality of Macondo, that imaginary Macondo, which was being created by Gabriel Garcia Marquez in this story, but rather it's being used as the central locale of this story, of this narrative. We will come to understand that we have also been inhabitant of society afterwards by different things I will come up to if time permits. It's a lot talking and etc. What Marquez does is not only giving us voices of biologic moments, only creating moments of carnival and etc., and making come alive to us through his pages. What was the purpose of doing so? Gabriel Garcia Marquez, as it is always been told, and in his interviews, he himself also thing several times. And what does he understand by this term commitment? He says that this commitment does not necessarily come from an ideological bias. He was a sociologist, he believed in socialism and etc., and he had a lot of hobnobbings with the communist leaders, with leaders of the third world countries, of different countries, even beyond Latin America and etc. That is not the issue. The issue is that he understands the very historical process of narrating Colombia and Latin America as it is being taken up by the historians and by the gaze of the Western world. It is America and Europe, and especially this Western world, who colonized this place. You know that Colombia was colonized by Spain for centuries. Then by 1800, they first they won their freedom, independence, and freedom was not then recognized and admitted in Spain back in Europe. And finally, it was being recognized with official Brazilian, etc., by the King of Spain somewhere around 1819. Our story, or rather our narrative, this book, 100 Years of Solitude, that begins somewhere around 1800. The story of Jose Arcadio Buendia Iguaran, his first cousin, Arcadio's first cousin, who was married to Arcadio. And with this thing, a lot of things altogether. And this was Arcadio Buendia and was the first founders of this township, a village, as it is being, 20 houses, it is being informed by the name of the tale. And then there grew this, the population grew, the whole economy grew, and several different things happened out there. That is the story, basically, which is being unraveling in front of us in a sprawling manner with ease and with lots of interest in it, almost as an alive being, almost that becomes a kind of an alive being, in front of us, and it keeps rolling up to that last page, the 422nd page of the book. Marquez was very aware of history. He said that, well, these things, colonizers were here, the Spanish people, and through the Spanish people, the European people and the European historians also formed a kind of a gaze which is very much informed by that European or Western episteme of knowledge, episteme of philosophy. That epistemological view of Colombia, a colonized nation, was being taken by them, and they started to write the history of Colombia. But the important thing is that still, Colombian was not writing the tale of the Colombians. It was history narrated through a colonial gaze first. And afterwards, even if independence, there comes naturally other fallouts of a big colonial things in our countries. Struggles between themselves. There are basically two groups, a group of ideological group who wanted to come to power, who were struggling for the power, where the liberals and the conservatives, and naturally the conservatives, they were the most dominant one. They won the power. They were not at all in favor of giving any power to the liberal groups, and actually there ensued a lot of struggle. There's a history of battles between the liberals, the conservative people, and the conservative group, which cuts the history of Colombia down from 1810 up to almost 1950s, because that battle was almost an everlasting battle, and Colombians did not have a chance to mold their history, to seek their history, to understand, to get back to the roots of their history from their own perspective. Because these very views, the ideological divisions of the liberals and the conservatives, those were also being made up and created and built up by their readings, and appropriations of the Western value system. পাশ্চাত্য যা শিখিয়েছে সেইভাবে নিজেকে দেখেছে, নিজের চোখে দেখেনি. So for them, this whole history of struggle, battle, struggle for independence, and was between them, and everything was being narrated from the eye, from the gaze, perspective of the Europeans. basically the Western episteme. And then there came end of 1890s and etc. There came countries rich in minerals, agricultural products, and lots of forest products and etc. etc. All the Latin American countries, you know that. And therefore, another force, another power, which started to come up by the end of the 19th century, and which became formidable by the first half of the 20th century, that was the US power, United States of America. Now, American capitalism, as it is known, the American capitalism, the capitalists of America, they took a keen interest into all these resources of Latin America. So Colombia was not also spared, and they came into Colombia with their factories, with their interests, profiteering, capital making, and etc. And they started to begin a new era of neo-colonialism, in which they were not grabbing the land or annexing the land, but they were simply making the most out of the economy, out of the resources, out of the agriculture, out of everything of the Latin Americans, and especially Colombia, and they were simply out like a leech, almost joke. They were sucking it out of Colombia and draining it out and not leaving it in fit or in terms of stake for the Colombian people. The people actually who had all rights to their own properties. So the Colombians basically were caught into a kind of time trap. Not only this time trap, this is also the event. First there was this colonial rule, and then there was this long drawn aftermath of the colonial rule, in which they did not have the time to look at themselves through their own gaze, through their own eye, through their own perspective. And on that, there was thrust a different kind of a modernity, techno-modernity, the techne, the term is more often than not used here, of course. The techno-modernity, aristocracy was being upon them, imposed upon them. They were made colonies without their awareness by the capitalists, in factories, in companies, in corporates, etc., etc. American factories, American total capitalist, this total capitalist archive was there, almost present with their interest and everything. So the passage from the feudal or almost the non-existing past, the clannish or the herd past, HERD herd, that is the collective past of the Colombians, the primitive past of the Colombians. There was passage from that past to the colonial past, colonial Spain, that is one of the formidable European colonizers, colonizing powers. And then there was a fallout of the colony. Then there was mistrust between themselves. There was this feudal group who became the conservatives or who supported Colombia, and the liberals were there who were trying to voice the voice of the common people. There was a tussle. There was no peace at all in between, and Colombia was taking shape in a different. All on a sudden, by the end of the 19th century and by the first and the second half of the 20th century, it's a surge of colonies in Colombia, which came from this, the United States of America. These companies established their almost empire of capital out there. Naturally, the Colombia did not have that opportunity to look at themselves from a pristine Colombian view, from a pristine third view, from a pristine view of the oppressor. And this is quite identical with situation also in India, and that our engagement point of time, social distancing, with an idea of solitude in India. Solitude, which is being given a beautiful expression by a master artist of literature like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in itself becomes very interesting, very engaging, very fruitful, perhaps, and maybe very, 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 very intriguing. We also shared our history with the Colombian people. Macondo, this fictional village, was set into Aracataca of Colombia. That information is, there are lots of informations about these things over the internet, and there is a whole page on areas of which is almost with all the things, but funnily, on such a surface level that you cannot form any idea of the book itself. The book is a great read if you go through it. Those of you who has already gone through it or who are going through it, perhaps will support me in appreciating the book in a different light, in that whatever we talk of history, we talk of the convoluted versions of history, we talk about the idea of time. In the linear idea of time is being destroyed by novel and quite deliberately. So apart from these things, book is a great book which writes about beautifully the whole past people, the intimate life of the people who live in land, a land which is being ravished and ravaged by several different interests of power. It is a battle between men who deny to die on a land of their own, and on the other hand, there is sometimes it is the colonial force, sometimes it is the feudal force, sometimes it is the neo-colonial force, or whatever it is. But there is a power, a capital, which is trying to erase them out. It's a continual battle between memory and fullness. That basically constitutes the theme of Solitude in 100 Years of Solitude. That is quite identical with us. In India also, the same happened. Let me come back to this point. Perhaps it will be better for us to have this more involved man that he was trying to, the title which I used for my session, little misleading, of course, and there are like mythic and etc. Basic point, or the fundamental point of the lecture, or whatever be the title, I also try only one thing, or I try to tell only one thing. I try to specify something, what is that this is definitely a beautiful work of fiction, but it is also a fiction which is giving us a different idea of history. And here history comes without footnotes. I first wanted to give the title of this session as History Without Footnotes, a reading of 100 Years of Solitude. And then I took resort to those flashy and flamboyant words, which are not normally following the fashion of I have done actually, following the fashion of the English owners and English masters, where some misfired words are normally used. Jokes apart, to make or a lecture more interesting or attractive or whatever it is. However, jokes apart. And this is a kind of a self-reflexive one. I'm not lodging this obligation of making details so fussy and so obfuscating on anybody else. It is actually a kind of a, you can say, self-criticism. This is basically history without footnotes, but not that history that we usually come across as history in our textbooks. The linear time scheme has been challenged here, destroyed, denied, rejected, and almost resisted very consciously by Gabriel Garcia Marquez while writing this story. You'll see that the chapters do not have any title, not even because this numerical juxtaposition with language is a kind of a fillet. One, this linear progression is the strategy of a linear progression, that chapter 1 always lead up to chapter 2, and chapter 2 will always lead up to chapter 3, and so on and so on. Here, what Marquez is doing is simply giving the chapter a name, or so to say, any numerical denominator, No one, two, nothing is there. Number is there because he is denying to fit in this numerical sequential order of history as we understand it. Our classrooms canonically influenced by these European epistemic ideas. Here, what he is trying to do is to give the ontic history of the Colombian people or the Latin American people. It is the ontology of the people, or the ontological history of the people, or the ontological perspective of history, which has been put into words in 100 Years of Solitude. What does he do? Going into that, and before that, I think that this will be of little help. This also, what he does in the book and how does he approach history book is very simple. If it is understood from our experience, there are ways to read any text, any novel, any fiction, any poetry. And naturally, there are different ways, different perspectives, different angles to take on novels and texts and etc. When we look at being English honor students in a country where English is predominantly taught as second language or third language, and not third language, but second language, and all of us have got our different mother tongues. At least English is not our mother tongue. Not in 99.99% of cases, for 99.99% honor students in the world. Sorry, in this country, in our country, in India. Most of us have got a kind of dual approach towards English. English, we are studying definitely this English language, English literature. It can also become our language. It has become our language. There is already, English is not anymore it is as a language of the English people only. This is very much our language, but almost all of us has got a different collective memory, different text, different context, different culture, something different to adhere to in our daily lives. And that is our Indianness. If you try to read a book taking our Indian experience or the experience of being an Indian into count, then we see different doors are opening to get into a text. And the funny thing that I was talking about, what is quite ironical also, as I find it ironical very much. I don't know whether you will also find it ironical or not, but I think that you can, is this, that in every criticism, in every critique, and in every reading 100 Years of Solitude, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, other stories, other fiction, short stories, and novels, most of the Western critics, they come to convolute their criticism with lots of jargons and phrases, ranging from magic realism, neorealism first, and then magic realism, and then post-expressionism, and then Latin American, the third world fiction, and the postmodern fiction finally. With all those theories of open-endedness, with all those theories of repetition, which are there many words and in many ways in 100 Years of Solitude. Things are repeated, even lines are repeated, dialogue repeated. At one point of time, Aureliano Segundo was repeating the words that Ursula used to say almost 50 years back. And Ursula, his grandmother, great grandmother, comes to stumble upon the line and say, "Oh man, he's repeating my dialogue." And she also says, reflects on it that, well, time does not change. Time does not go anywhere. It simply repeats itself. It's an endless loop of repetition in which all of us, generation after generation, are being caught into. Now, that is her reflection, of course, and that is also the reflection of the book. But my point is that Western canon and Western criticism, Western way of looking into a text, has found it quite baffling to deal with the ideas and the ways the narration goes in 100 Years of Solitude. What do? Their etymological knowledge, as I am using this word repeatedly enough, their kind of theory of knowledge has taught them that we have to understand everything first. Rationally, we have to understand everything, quote unquote. Understanding means that nothing in this life will remain unknown to me. Everything should be explained. Now, explanation and understanding are two different words. But we try to understand everything in terms of explanation. Anything that cannot be explained is, defined by them, is identified by them as something magical, something uncanny, something which is not fitting into the canon of our known world or known perceptions or rationality and etc. And then they try to understand everything in a sequential order. So first, they try to normalize something through their explanation into their experiences. But Marquez was consciously and deliberately rejecting the Western episteme or the European episteme of writing, of narratology, of narrative practices, everything. The very storytelling attitude was basically being rejected by Marquez in a very conscious manner in 100 Years of Solitude. So when the writer is himself coming up, the author, is himself coming up with a deliberate project and strategy to reject, deny, and resist the Western style of writing, then the critics readers are coming back to it with all the whole array of their critical weapons, their terms, their phrases, all their new theories and etc., to pin it down to, again, an explainable epistemic Western order, as if the text should be written or text should be approached in this order. I find it very funny. Say, suppose I am telling you that you don't understand this thing. And you are telling me, well, I don't understand this thing. I want to understand this not understanding by understanding it in my way of understanding. Now that becomes quite funny, quite ironical. It's self a failure. Why they were doing such thing? Because this kind of a narration, what is there employed as a strategy in 100 Years of Solitude, was not present in the European history and, so to say, in the European collective memory. Even if that was present, ages back, years back, centuries back, they have already forgotten that thing. And from that moment of Renaissance, when they started to define everything in terms of their rational and logical superiority, when they tried to give to every aspect of nature, culture, everything, or when they tried to construe every aspect of nature and culture and everything, all our knowledge and everything, with a sequential order, with rationality, with logic, then they created a different kind of a superstition. They were dealing with knowledgelessness and with knowledge, and finally they landed into a land of unknowledge when such a text was challenging them with their knowledge system and asking them that, or rather claiming to them that, look, I am reclaiming history from your hand. It is not your history. It is not the history written from a distance. It is the intimate history of our people, of our life, of our feelings, of our emotion, of our dreams, of the dreams that we have not even dreamt yet. Our premonitions, our superstitions, our everything, our way of life, as we ourselves are. This is the history of our being, collective being. And as we are writing this thing, we are rejecting your way of looking at this thing. You look at it from a different angle. I look at it from an intimate angle. The distanciation is not there. Then they found it quite hard to grapple with this text. They could not easily come in terms with the text. So therefore they used a lot of words, a lot of technical things, a lot of hyper reality, super reality, and blah, 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 blah. I'm not going into those details because those PDF articles are all available over the internet, and you can also order some books over Amazon, Flipkart, or whatever be the purchasing medium, online medium out there, the business tycoons out there, business platforms out there. My point is that if we for a second, a minute, ponder upon our experience. If we try to connect to the text from our vantage point of being an Indian, because our history, our colonial past, our pre-colonial presence, our history of mutual mistrust, distrust, and struggles and battles, the colonial aftermath, the fallout, and the post-independence era, and also this era since 1990 of corporate capitalism, market capitalism, and etc., etc. If we take all these experiences into account and form our own reading habit, or if we become a little bit aware of our reading habit, then we see that this book, 100 Years of Solitude, is not sounding something alien to us. We are, or we shall not be, rummaging through all kinds of, we will not be desperately and madly searching through all kinds of, critical gears, phrases, and terms to pin down this text to our slate of understanding. No. If we are a little bit aligned to our experiences of reading, literature, everything, then we see that this book uses a narrative technique which has a frame narrative into it. And this frame narrative technique, maybe Gabriel Garcia Marquez took from, definitely from one source of this frame narrative was, of course, in the oral literature, in the heard through, heard from his grandparents and etc. The oral literature are basically all over the world. Any oral thing, orators are basically losing structure, pattern, and in therefore it is much more important and much more, what should I say, much more Catholic to entwine a lot of things, a lot of disparate things into it. It's a dialectical movement which is often observed in an oral literature. But that is not the case with literature itself when it is being written, as it is being taught to us by the Western episteme. But if we rely upon our experience of reading a text, our experience of going through literature, then we see that this experience of frame narrative and putting the rest of the stories into the fold of that frame narrative is not very new. It is basically out there, and Gerald Martin, I'm extremely sorry. Gerald Martin is the person who gave us the standard biography of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Gerald Martin himself is a big biographer, a big critic of Latin American literature, etc., etc., big scholar. Gerald Martin informs us that Gabriel Garcia Marquez is one of the favorite books throughout his childhood days and even afterwards was 1001 Arabian Nights. And what happens in Arabian Nights? We see that there are definitely, that 1001 Arabian Nights, there are 1000 tales, and there was a queen, of course, Iranian queen, Sherzadi. Sherzadi was married to Shahryar, the Caliph of Iran. And the Caliph of Iran was murderous for different reasons. I'm not going into that story of 1001 Arabian Nights. I'm simply concerned with the kind of narrative which is being used out there. The Caliph was murdered, and Caliph told that, and Caliph, decided that I'm going to kill all my wives. Every night, every day, I shall marry one girl. And once passing one night with her, I will kill her on the next morning. And again on the next day, I will marry another girl, and on the next morning, I will kill her. So in this way, I'm going to live with one girl, one new girl each new night. And in this way, I will exterminate almost a race of the girls and a race of the women, etc., from this earth. There's a different tale. There's a different tale of coercion and patriarchal maneuvers and etc. Not going into that. Sherzadi was the one who was married to the Shahryar or the Caliph. Sherzadi was very knowledgeable and wise, and she read sciences, she read stories, myths, and everything. She was quite equipped with a lot of knowledge and etc. She maneuvered a strategy to survive, not to be killed, after one single night by the Caliph. She managed to maneuver a kind of a strategy of telling a story each night to the Caliph. And the stories were, she used to let them unfinished by the end of the night. And the Caliph was very intrigued by the stories. He took immense interest, keen interest in the stories. Stories were marvelous. And so therefore, once the Caliph was much engaged aesthetically into the stories, then the Caliph did not kill the Sherzadi and waited for the next day to finish the next day for her to finish the story, and decided that, well, I'll kill you on the second. I'm not killing you on the first. I'm kill you on the second after you finish the story. And now that was the strategy of Sherzadi. Sherzadi started to spin out another story on the second night after finishing the first one, and left it unfinished. And on the third night, she again finished the second story and spun out another tale of a story, thread of a story. In this way, she passed 1,000 nights with the king. She was not killed. And finally, in this process of listening to the stories, the Caliph fell in love with Sherzadi and did not kill Sherzadi, and blah, 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 blah. This is the happy ending. They kept on living happily ever after. What happened that? In that tale, it was being told, and it goes almost imperceptibly by the reader. It passes by imperceptibly. Nobody takes very much care about this thing, and nobody used to very much care about this thing, that some lines are being given out there, written out there, in 1001 Arabian Nights, that Sherzadi's tales were not that important always. The tales themselves, what are the stories, are were not always very intriguing, and not always very attractive, were not always very captivating. But the way she narrated her stories, that was very captivating, that was fascinating, and it used to create a hypnotic spell on the Khalifa. What is the crux? The central point is this, that then we are coming across two things in text. The broad name of the text is, of course, 1001 Arabian Nights. The Arabian, this name was not there. It was being included in the English translation. First, the basic Arabic tale is known as 1001 Nights. But this 1001 Nights, the text is 1001 Nights, as if we are trying to read one text containing 1,000 stories. But there is another story also, the story of how to tell a story. This is the story that becomes more interesting than the stories which are being told out there. How to tell a story is absolutely different from what to tell. The 1,000 tales which are being related by Sherzadi to Caliph are the stories, the 1,000 stories. But the way that she used to tell them was so captivating, so fascinating, that the Caliph could not move away from his bedchamber in the attraction, in the fascination of the stories. This is the trope which was being used by Satyajit Ray in his Gopika in Bhagabain, when Gopi used to sing out loud, of course, then everybody got charmed and nobody could move. This is basically the thing, is that the narration itself becomes a text. How it is being narrated and what is being narrated, that also becomes a text. So if we look at it with that awareness, being an aware reader, we see that in these parts of the Orient, in India, in Persia. You know perhaps that 1001 Arabian Nights, these tales are nothing but collection collected over years through oral literature. These were being spoken to from one person to the orally, and it was being much afterwards by 1000 or by 900 AD or something like that. But before that, for almost 1000 years, it was being told and retold and narrated and re-narrated over a big span of area, taking into account India, Persia, Arabia, Egypt, etc., etc. So there are Indian tales, there are Persian tales, these are now being proved, and there are Arabic tales, all compiled together under the big head of 1001 Arabian Nights. So the point is, in India then, in Persia then, or big in China also, we have a big tradition of listening to stories. And at the same time, in that same story, we also come to listen to how that story is being told. That is also the format used in the Kirtans. That is also the format used in Ramayana and Mahabharata. That is nothing new from our point of view. If we look at it, 100 Years of Solitude, where this story is being written by the character is already in the story. It is the story written by Melchiades the gypsy, who denies to die, who does not die easily, who comes back repetitively, either in the physical form or in the form of a ghost, a spirit. Comes back, does not haunt anybody, sits upon his parchment, and he writes that parchment, an Armenian gypsy writing in Sanskrit language in a Colombian village, which was being colonized by Spain, and the people talk in Spanish language. This is the kind of a global experience loaded together in 100 Years of Solitude. Melchiades, he is a character within the tale, and he is writing the tale. And from page 1 to the last page, we come across Melchiades' narration. And by the last, it is being told that by 100 Years of Solitude, what does it mean? We see that the main characters out there, Ursula Iguaran, Colonel Aureliano Buendia, even Colonel Aureliano Buendia's father and Ursula Iguaran's husband, Jose Arcadio Buendia, they all live more than 100 years on this earth in Macondo. We see that the prostitute, who is a very key character in the novel, in this narrative of 100 Years of Solitude, Pilar Ternera, she also lives somewhere around 126 years or something like that on this earth. So almost all of them are living more than 100 years. Then what does it mean that the book named as 100 Years of Solitude? We see that it is not basically defining the people who are being told or narrated, whose lives are being told or narrated in this book. It is the people, it is the book itself. Because at one point, Melchiades comes as a spirit to the last one who deciphers the book of this family, the 6th generation Aureliano. And to Aureliano, he says that, well, it is not that you wait for a book. Oh, sorry, it is not that the book waits for you. Rather, you should wait for a book. The book becomes alive, animated. He says that the parchments that I have already written, I have, scribed together. These parchments take 100 years before you can decipher them. It takes 100 years to ripen into maturity, into wisdom. And by the end, when Aureliano is absolutely left on this world, and a hurricane is beaming up, a big storm that will simply sweep away even the name, the last peak of Macondo from the face of this earth. Before that cataclysmic moment, before that apocalyptic moment, Aureliano comes to understand, starts to decipher the Sanskrit parchment left by Melchiades. And then he sees, quite interestingly, that this is basically the history of the Buendia family, the history of whole Colombia, the history of our life living in put not in a sequential order, but in a cyclical order, where the barriers, the divisions, the walls between past, present, future are being collapsed. Time becomes fluid. The normal, traditional, conform, or should I say, the traditional time scheme of epistemic history is being denied, not conformed to, not appropriated. Time is being time and again questioned what time is. Time is being put into fragments, has been put under the microscope in such a way so that we can look at time at the same time overlapping as a circular motion in a cyclical whole. It's a spiral wave of time, one cycle falling on the other cycle, one lap, the other lap, and it is overlapping time, absolutely fluid, where the past, present, and future are all fused together. Aureliano sees or deciphers the hurricane brews up by the end of the novel, and Aureliano deciphers that, well, I am the person that this book is talking about. He comes across those lines in which his secret of birth is being kept. He to understand who he is, the son of Meme or Renata Remedios. And he comes to understand that the person he loved most in this life and that he had his son with, she is Amaranta Ursula, is nothing but her own aunt, Mashi, Choto Mashi. And that was the incestuous relationship. But he was not bothering about all those things. He was bothered about only one thing, that how do I die? Where does it end? Where is the future? He skipped some of the lines by the end and tried to come to that line where in Sanskrit Miltiades has already written the future of Aureliano and the last line about Macondo. He reaches that line, he cannot decipher it, or rather, he is deciphering it, and at the same time, he is living it. Look at the point that Miltiades has already written his parchment. So the parchment was written in the past time. In the past time, it was being written about a time which has not yet come. Aureliano, in his present moment, is deciphering something which talks of his own life, which is already being written in the past by somebody called Miltiades. He tries to counter his moment of future, and the future comes in his present moment. The moment the future comes, he stumbles on the last line. Present and future come together and the hurricane sweeps away Macondo. Everybody is lost. And there comes the last line. It's a beautiful line. Says that, I'm reading from the novel, it's the last line, that Aureliano Buendia would finish deciphering the parchments and that everything written on them was unrepeatable since time immemorial and forevermore, because races condemned to 100 years of solitude did not have a second opportunity on earth. It is basically us who are reading our own history. It is not Aureliano. Because with Aureliano, we come to understand that Ramayana was written before the birth of Rama. Every now and then we come across this kind of a phrase in India that Valmiki writes Ramayana before the birth of Ramayana, and within Ramayana, the text, several times, more than almost 20 times, this whole tale of Ramayana, along with Rama's death, rather Rama's deliberate death, and etc., are being narrated to Ram himself, once by Lakshman, once by Jambuvan, once by Hanuman, and lastly by Lava and Kush, Ram's own sons. The whole story of Ramayana is being repeated to him, is being sung to him. So the Ramayana is already there within the tale Ramayana. And Ram himself is listening to his tale in his lifetime about his future. Aureliano is also just like that, comes to, for him, the senses between past, present, and future is blurred, and he comes to meet the future in his present moment. When it happens, then time breaks, hurricanes, and everything is swept out. They are simply being airbrushed out. Their history, their modes of references, their magic, their superstition, their way of life, their science, their banana massacre, from where the whole history took a different turn when a United Fruit Company came over there, an American company, and shoot almost 3,000 people, of which there is no recorded history in European historical practices. Marquez gives us this clue repeatedly that we have to somehow repeat these things to ourselves to keep intact our memory, because for us, memory is history. Our history is not written. So therefore, we have to recapitulate our history. We have to keep them in memory. We cannot forget them, because to forget them means to forgive them. This mnemonic practice, unforgiving, whatever you have done, the capitalists, to our country, we cannot forgive you. This denial to forgive makes Gabriel Garcia Marquez not to forget what happened during the colonial rule, during the neo-colonial rule, during the capitalist invasion of the American Fruit Company into Colombia, and that banana massacre that happened in 1928, when 3,000 people were being killed, and afterwards it was being written in a report by the magistrate that no one was being killed. And afterwards, even researchers also stumbled across those documents and saw that no, there was no killings which ever been, perpetrated in Aracataca, the real village in which Gabriel Garcia Marquez grew up in his childhood, and which was basically being fictionalized in the form of Macondo in this particular novel. We are made the surrogate. Aureliano is our surrogate character. We, the readers, also do enter the text. We don't know when. And in this way, we are being left in a quandary, in a doubt, by the end of the thing, where we see that the whole novel that stands in front of us, we are not sure whether we have come across, we have hit across the last line of the novel or not, because there is no conclusion, no ending. We come to the last line of the novel, definitely, with this sense that the novel was already being written. We come to the last line of not the novel, but the last line of the life of Aureliano. The last one, if we leave aside, of course, the seventh generation pig-tailed Aureliano, born to Aureliano, his child, who was just after his birth, who was being killed by the ants, the red ants, So the last of the family, of the Buendia family, Aureliano, we come to read the last line of his life. But at the same time, we are left with this message, we are left with this thing, with this uneasiness that the story is already being told and was already being written in the parchments of Melquiades. Melquiades is the writer of the whole novel, the narrator. And the narrator himself is a character within the novel, just like 1,000 Nights, Arabian Nights. Sherzadi is the narrator and at the same time a character within the narration. A frame narrative is there. Without the frame narrative, without the reference to the frame narrative, we cannot at all appreciate the other narratives which are being looped into in a cyclical manner in this particular narrative of 100 Years of Solitude. And there are several other things, but I don't know whether time permits or not. This is already 4:06. If there's anything to say, I am muting my one. This was really, I don't know, I could make any point at all clear on this thing. Just I read and I went through the novel for the third time perhaps in my life when I was given this assignment very kindly by Anuradhati. And I thought that this is always better not to go into some quotations and etc. and citations. I already wrote a lot of things and also put a lot of books just beside me. If I require them, I can cite them with this purpose. But I finally thought it that I will simply let myself go with my some experiences with the world, the latest experience with a novel. Perhaps that will be at least if uh, attempt of clarification. It might be an attempt of making you more intrigued towards the, more interested into the novel, that the novel talks of so many things. Is it so? And so, whoever of you have not still taken any interest in reading the novel, might take an interest, not always to prove me myself correct, but it is not always to prove myself correct. It is only to to understand that, to have an experience which is so rich in language, which is also sometimes fail, not Gabriel Garcia Marquez's language, but as such, the very validity of language is also being questioned in the novel. So if some of you are very interested in the theories of language, what is signified, that also gives you a very good idea. It's an example of a very good of those linguistic experimentations in this novel. You can find out, and at the same time, it's a good read, it's a beautiful read, and most importantly, it's a connectable read. You can relate to the experiences. These are the experiences that we people do have in our third world countries. This is basically a third world novel. It is a magic realist novel, but magic realism is an intrinsic power to all experience, collective experience. And that is why I think that it is always worth a good deal to go through. All the writings of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but most specifically this 100 Years of Solitude. Thank you. I'm muting my sound button, and if there is any observation, anything of that sort, you can simply flurry in.
Thank you, sir, for such an enriching lecture, and it's really filled with facts and lot of observations that has given us a lot of inspiration to read further. Now, I would ask if anyone has any question, they can ask. I think we have our first question by Otish Dash. He's asking, does 100 Years of Solitude try to depict the history as a cultural hobnob?
Should I answer? Yeah, Otish Dash. Thank you, Aratrika, and thank you, Otish. It is a cultural hobnob. Definitely, it is a cultural hobnob. But most importantly, it is not a cultural hobnob, or rather, not only so. This is absolutely my reading that I can talk about, because there are several readings on the idea of history in 100 Years of Solitude. For me, this is not only cultural hobnob, this is something more than that. It is basically a battle of memory against forgetfulness, or not even forgetfulness. It is basically, the battle against our habit of, comfortable numbness. That is the thing. What makes Gabriel Garcia Marquez, for my reading, as I find it quite tenable, of course, after going through it 3 times or 4 times, that it is a continuous battle between forgetfulness and cultural, and a numbness, a comfortable numbness that we usually acquire after forgetting our own history. It is a battle against that numbness, and he is trying to make us unsettle with the experiences that once a country like a continent like Latin America had, and that kind of a thing is being put towards us. Coming back to your very old coinage about cultural hobnob, I would like to say that cultural hobnob means he is also hobnobbing with his culture, and there is also an intracultural hobnob or intercultural hobnob. Of course, that is there. And there are different cultures, culture codes, and etc. etc. But how he is looking at history is more determined not by the culture, but by his relentless resistance towards a stereotypical historical formation. It is basically his resistance towards a power narrative or the narrative of power. It is basically even the cultural hobnob that you are talking about, whatever culture is coming out or finally precipitating from this reading of the novel, the specificity of that culture is not at all important. As I was trying repeatedly in my session to talk of, is that we being Indians, we being Pakistanis, we being Sri Lankans, we being Africans, we being Arabians, we will come across a lot of similar things when we come to read this thing from flap to flap. We are not necessarily Colombians. It is not the specificity of culture. Rather, it is basically the concern with one's culture. And the levity of that word hobnob, I just try to tackle it in a different manner. Of course, I'm putting it aside and I'm making it a little more serious, that it is that cultural awareness, which is an elementary part to go through and to understand one's own history, that is being put on the face of power and the power narration of history by Gabriel Garcia Marquez as a strategy of resistance. That is my reading. Thank you.
Any
Hello.
more question?
Hello.
Yes, Sharadindu.
Hello.
Yes, Sharadindu, we can hear you. You can ask.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir, for the very engaging session. You have talked about solitude, the central theme maybe of the 100 years of solitude. My question is that Garcia, can the solitude be applied, be allied metaphorically to the Marxian concept of alienation in this novel? Hello.
Hello. Can you listen to me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, no. This Marxian concept of alienation, so far I understand, of course, is a little bit of a different thing. This solitude that Marquez was talking about, and he has repeatedly talked of it even afterwards, even after writing this novel, on several interviews also. He defines it not only in terms of an alienation, he defines it as I found it always through going through his interviews and going through other writings, of course, that he tries to define it in terms of a humor, in terms of a dampness. I'm talking about humor, not in the term of humorous. I'm talking about humor. You understand, because you are a student of English literature, all of you. So you understand that, and just recall that idea of comedy of humus and etc. And the humus in our body, the fluids, which do basically determine our temperaments and mood and etc., which correspond to the four elements of the earth, of elemental things: fire, water, blah 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 blah, etc. So those that humor means, Rushdie was the one who made it quite clear in one of his lectures, Salman Rushdie, that humor is basically dampness. What Gabor was doing, Marquez was doing, and it is being discussed also at length in several write-ups, was trying to look at this Colombian history, the intimate lives of the Colombians lived over a period of 100 years almost, not with an eye which is sentimentally wet, not even with the eye which is cynically dry. It is not totally wet, dry. It is something in between. That in-betweenness can be defined in terms of dampness. Rushdie says that our eye is a damp thing. And with that dampness, we look at something. It's the affectation that we gather out of our experiences, out of our that makes us temperamentally a little damp. Now, where from this dampness comes? Now, this dampness can be understood. Now, I'm switching from Rushdie to Marquez. Says that Marquez in one of his interviews says that this is temperament. This is basically the guilt, the awareness. This is known as solitude. Everybody has a solitude. I am not talking about merely talking about solitude, or rather, I would not love to in my reading, definitely in my personal reading. Readings may vary, and I do honor every reading, of course, but I personally find it a little uneasy to go with this idea of alienation as it happens in the cases of the Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Marquez, in one of his interviews, tells quite exorbitantly over a length that I have written only one single novel. Perhaps it will help us to understand this solitude thing, as Shorodindu has asked. So I'm told that I have written only one novel. And what is the novel? Says that one single theme that I have always come back to in every reading of mine, and that is solitude. And what kind of a solitude is it? Because in character, in tone, in temperament, even in writing style, Autumn of the Patriarch, one of the best of Marquez, is absolutely different from this book, 1967, 1 Years of Solitude. These two books are so different. And Marquez links them up and says, well, there is also solitude. What solitude? Say it. Aureliano Buendia, Colonel Aureliano Buendia dies a day of solitude. This solitude is a guilt out of or stemming out of misplaced pride. He joined the liberal army in the novel, not in love, but for an individual pride, a pride which was misplaced. And he had a condition in his life. And what was that? And it is quite beautifully written in the novel also, that Aureliano Buendia's problem was the inability to love. From this inability to love, conjoined with his misplaced pride, individual pride, is formed his solitude. It is the solitude of pride that basically kills Aureliano Buendia. For Ursula, it's a different kind of a solitude. It's a solitude of that lifelong effort to unite and stitch together all the members and the events of his family, the history of the family, and finally becoming inability. Her inability comes, of course, in the metaphorical form of blindness. And finally, she is not able to bind them together. The Macondo tree, which is basically weaved around the figure of Ursula Iguaran, is destined to fall apart. That is her solitude. Amaran dies with a different kind of a solitude. The solitude of death is also there. Malda is almost a supernatural character who is there present by the beginning of the novel physically, and afterwards comes back as a spirit. Is suffering from the solitude of communication. And finally, when he is able to set up a communication in terms of the deciphering of the Sanskrit text with Aureliano, the last one, then he gradually vanishes. There is another very interesting character. Arcadio Buendia, the first one, Colonel Aureliano Buendia's father, he left his Riohasha village and came down Macondo to absolutely found a different, new village, driven by the solitude, the guilt that he incurred by killing one of his friends in a cockfight. And that friend comes back to him repeatedly, just materializes in front of his eyes, his lunatic eyes, was tied to the chestnut tree in his yard. In his later years, and just before his death, he used to come to him and used to complain that, look, I am all alone. I cannot live on that big pasture of death alone anymore. Can you come to me? We can again be friends and play endlessly and infinitely our cockfights in that land of death. It is the solitude of death which is haunting a spirit or a ghost. I don't think that Marxian idea of alienation, which is basically understood and interpreted in terms of social relations, can be that much, applicable to the solitude of a ghost or a spirit. So that is my take, of course, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez himself told repeatedly everywhere that this is the solitude of being absolutely different in different ways, in multiple ways. Solitude of being polyphonic than uniphonic or monophonic, which makes us different from the European experience, is this experiential solitude that drives me to write these novels. Perhaps in this way, solitude can be seen, but not strictly according to my view. Of course, again, I'm telling you, I am never ever ready to impose my on anybody. Sure, perhaps you are listening to me. You can attempt to read this thing from the angle and the perspective of Marxian solitude, Marxian alienation. But this alienation that I'm talking about is this temperamental alienation. Temperamental alienation of not only the individuals, but of the whole host of individuals, the collectiveness, as it is almost applicable for all experiences all over the world. Solitude that he was addressing. Solitude was also a strategy for him to resist that. Writing the economist and conventional right style of his historiography of the Western world, in which solitude is never recorded, bias is not recorded, fact recorded, both is not recorded. So that these many numbers of people are listening to this session. All of us, for example, suppose we are 50 people who are now joined together. If we are going to write European history of these 50 people coming together, meet and taking a class, then we have to write it factual order. So that 50 people took class from this hour to this hour on solitude. That is fact. But the truth is, not all of us, that is natural. I'm not blaming anybody. Not all of us are that much keen to take the classes. Also to say, some of us are listening to it, some of us has joined it with some other thought at the back of our mind. Our feelings are different, our engagements are different. All of us are different while we are taking this class. The truth of the class is something different. The fact of us is something different. In between comes solitude. It is this indeterminate solitude that was being approached.
Thank you, sir. Thank
We have one more question from Atish. The question is how Marcus has shown the role of religion to colonize the minds of Colombians in the novel.
Can you repeat the question, please, Ratrika, once more?
Yes, sir. He's asking how Marcus has shown the role of religion to colonize the minds of Colombians in the novel.
Role of religion to colonize the mind in the novel. There are quite straightforward passages in several. Of course, I was not taking religion as one of the most important things while preparing for the session, but definitely I can get back to some parts in my memory. So far, I can recollect that Catholicism and this Catholic idea of a church was being promoted by the Conservative Party, and there are the whole life of Colonel Aureliano Buendia being a liberal leader. He was a colonel of the Liberal Party, Liberal Uprising, and he was against the authority of the church. He was initially against establishment of a church in Macondo village, and afterwards other came, or the fathers came, one or other. They were deputed by the Roman Catholic churches. They were promoted, of course, because religion goes hand in hand with imperialist forces. This what to understand this thing, we need not to go necessarily go back to Marx and Engels. We all know in 2020, religion has ever been or has ever played institutional religion, especially that I am talking about, not the small rituals which are being followed in the intimate households. Established, organized, and institutional religion allows to favor the ruling parties. Ruling parties means the ruling power. So feudalism and afterwards capitalism and colonialism mainly, all of them started to retain their power and to make themselves more safe in the way of ruling, dominating over people. They have always used strategically religion as a tool. So that is also true in this Macondo also, in 100 Years of Solitude. But more importantly, what is religion, or this Catholic religion, what is being shown in a different light by Marquez in the character, not of the priests or the fathers of the church in Macondo, but in the character of Fernanda, that is the wife of Aureliano II. Aureliano II is perhaps, if I can remember properly, it is the fourth generation Aureliano. First, let me remind first, if I'm clear about this thing or not. This is Jose Arcadio Buendia, and then Colonel Aureliano Buendia, and then comes Arcadio and Aureliano, and then comes from Arcadio Aureliano II. Yes, Aureliano II's wife Fernanda comes from a typical, or rather stereotypical, Catholic family, and she holds a worldview which is more aligned towards the medieval view of Christianity than the Renaissance view of Christianity. This medieval view of Christianity naturally believes in a kind of a rigorous code of life. Fernanda also tried to live a rigorous code of life. She is single-handedly responsible for the exile of her eldest child, that is Renata Remedios, whose nickname was Mimi, and whose son was, of course, that key character in the sixth generation, Aureliano, whom we come across by the last lines of the novel also. The last man standing, that was Aureliano. So Aureliano's mother was Renata Remedios, who was expelled and exiled from the village because she had an affair with somebody beyond the village of Macondo. That man, his name was, the boy rather, his name was Mauricio Babylonia. He was a motor mechanic in that habitat where the fruit company laid their township. So he was a man outside the basic group of Colombians living in Macondo. Fernanda was an epitome of medieval Catholic rigors, and she died a death. It is quite interesting. Once you have asked this question of religion, then it comes to my mind that for about all the characters, this word solitude comes very first in the introduction of their characteristic traits or personality traits. Solitude is a recurring term, it's a recurring in describing the characters in multiple different ways, in polyphonic ways. But this particular word does not occur for Fernanda for a long stretch of time. And when I was going through the novel, I saw that, well, all the religious things are coming, an expression of all the religious fundamental values of Christianity, of Christian Catholicism. She does not have any kind of liberal attitude in her, and she despises the whole liberal history of this household. She despises anything revolutionary, and she is quite at ease with the values of the the banana company, that United Fruit Company, or the conservative of Colombia, conservative rulers of Colombia, because she thinks that the crisis of this family is their irreligiosity. She detects irreligiosity as the crisis point, as the crisis of this family. And so therefore, this religiousness of Fernanda does not allow Gabriel Garcia Marquez to use the word solitude to the characteristic trait of Fernanda's personality. But when Fernanda dies or about to die, then in that description, Gabo writes, that is the book writes, Melquiades writes rather, in 100 Years of Solitude, that she dies in the solitude of her rigor. This is the rigor. The word was a little bit different perhaps, but that means, or that transpires into this meaning of rigor, that this is her whole life of consternation. That is the word. Yes, I can. Catholic value system. They believed in a pagan value system. It is their own views of mysteries of the world, their totems and taboos, etc., that they maintained. Now, the Buendias, we were living at that.
We felt very interesting about the colonial history and its connection with modernity, mythic interpretation, and finally with our country, that is India. We have seen a lot of similarities.
100 Years of Solitude. That is all. And thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Your experience has already inspired us to read more. And I'm sure see you sometime in our college physically too. We have great interaction.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm ending.
Thank you.
So that's the end of the session for joining with us. Bro, you can end the session.
Okay.